Good evening. Just had some thoughts, wanted to share, and I wanted to say it from the perspective of Christianity. I'm a Christian and have worked in many years in Christian circles, and so I've, over the years, gathered a lot of thoughts about Christianity and about how I feel as a Christian. So along the way, I have things that I want to share. And this is a story that's about a normal day in the light. And we know the feeling of warmth once we've experienced it. There's three stories here that are sort of mingled together and they make a general theme. The first is a simple message that says if you walk in light, then you know the experience of how the warmth of the air feels, the sun, when you go out and you're being warm. You can get the same warmth from putting on coats and wrapping up in blankets and many other ways that will also keep you warm. But nothing can replace the warmth of sunlight. Nothing can replace the heat of a day that's outside. A great temperature that I think is, 70s, 80s. I don't even mind the 90s, although 90s is a little bit warm for a lot of us. But I don't even mind 90s really. Sometimes hundreds are a little bit warm. But once you get used to being in the really hot day, then even hundreds aren't too bad. But what I'm trying to say is the warmth of the sun is a wonderful thing. But if you're afraid of warmth, you're afraid of the sun, then you're going to always be in darkness and you'll always be scared of going outside into the sun because you don't know what it is. And so fearfully you might never experience the warmth of the sun. And of course I'm speaking in sort of a symbolic term, but what that relates to is the warmth that one finds in the presence of Jesus Christ. He is the one who gives light and life and direction and hope in the life of a Christian. It's all based in one simple truth. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. And this is the part many people don't know. They don't hear this part. But the next verse says, this is John 3:16 and 17 in the New Testament of the Bible. It says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He's not about cursing you and making you feel every time you've done something wrong that he's got this big sheet up in heaven and he marks off every single time that we've done something wrong. We don't need any help with that because inside of us we know what's right and wrong. And that's how we even know that we were created in the image of God, is because within us he put the scales of knowing right and wrong. It's built in, man. It's in us. And some people have seared it and it gets cold in them and they just get empty. But each one of us has that. So being good and being perfect doesn't get you into heaven. What gets you into heaven and saves you from your own darkness is Jesus Christ. And that's the part of the first story that I wanted to share with you. The other two parts have to do with people that have seen or know ways to find God. And the first story is about someone in the Old Testament, and you can find this story in the 26th and following chapters of Numbers. And it's a story about a king and a soothsayer who is able to predict the future. And the king has a great desire to overtake Israel. And he's a king of another country. And what he wants to do is he's found out about Balaam. And the king's name is Balak. And Balak has found out about Balaam. And what he wants Balaam to do is to get with God and to curse Israel so he can defeat them. And so Balak goes and he sends a message to Balaam and he says, if you will curse, if you will help me to find a way to get God to curse Israel, then I will give you many rewards, much remuneration, monetary gains, and all kind of things. And in Balaam's world, he's probably needing money and resources and who knows what all he's trying to have. And so he goes along the way and rides on his donkey, and he wants to figure out maybe there's some kind of way for it all to work, and maybe he doesn't have to curse Israel. Maybe there's a way he can just do it. And so he's on his way, riding on his horse, on his donkey, and the donkey won't go. He just stops. And Balaam is kicking him in his side and trying to get him to move, and he won't move. And God opens the mouth of the donkey. He opens the mouth of a donkey, and the donkey says, if you saw what was just up the road, you'd stop kicking me in the side. He says, there's an angel of the Lord ahead of us, and his sword is drawn to slay you. And Balaam is shocked at these words. And following, he understands that God has got an extreme perspective about Israel and about people that are in covenant with him. Covenant's another big word. We'll talk about that some other time. Now, so let's get back to the part where Balak is sending a message to Balaam. And Balaam gets to him and says, look, you need to understand something. The only thing that I'm going to tell you is what God says to me. On the backdrop of his ride on that donkey, he's gotten a real clear perspective. Now, his personal relationship, we don't know exactly where that was with heaven. So apparently he was able to, do some weird stuff and was able to hear things about the future and find out details. But he starts doing his shakers and weird stuff and whatever it is that he uses to do his conjuring, and who he conjures up is God. And God says very simply to him, on the backdrop of this is where God speaks to him though. He tells King Balak, he says, look, King, tell you what you do. You build 7 altars and you put oxes and all kinds of things that normally please God in the Old Testament that would be pleasing. He said, you give those to God and we'll see what he says to me. And so on the backdrop of that, the king does what he says, and Balaam goes and he listens to God in his way. Who knows how it is? I don't know, maybe he throws his head under a blanket and breathes eucalyptus oil. Who knows? I don't know how he did it, but he had a way, and he could hear a sound. Somehow he did his own way. And of course, all these things are not the way that we hear from God, but it was the way he was trying to hear. And finally, God just spoke to him plainly. First of all, it was through, who knows, maybe he'd throw some dice, or maybe he had his own way. There was some way he would able to get messages. And so that's crazy, and it's not the way we do. He was just practice this sort of weird stuff. Anyways, but he did that 3 times. The king did this. He says, because every time Balaam would come back to him, because God would speak to him and say, I'm not going to curse Israel. They are going to be blessed always by me. Their generations will be like the sands of the sea. They're going to be blessed. They're going to overtake all the people that try to fight against them. They are blessed. And the king says to him 2 more times after this, in 2 different places. He think another place is going to do a little better, or maybe some other time is going to work a little better, but God's voice doesn't change. And each time he'd make more sacrifices, and Balaam would say to him, make another 7 altars and sacrifice on all of them. He did it 3 times. And finally the king says to him, you ain't telling me anything that's going to help me defeat Israel. You can just go your way. I'm not giving you anything. And Balaam says to him, I told you twice, and I told you that I would not tell you anything that God didn't say to me. But let me make this clear to you. This last time, I spoke to him plainly, and it wasn't through some other means. It was a clear conversation. And so this is very simple. God is going to defeat all of his adversaries through Israel. Israel is going to end up having generations that are going to be kings and priests, and I'm ad-libbing a little bit here, but the end of the story is Israel and Judah are going to produce kings and leaders and people that are going to defeat everything that's around them. And they'll be in charge. And that was how it was going to be. So the king, frustrated, went his way, and Balaam went his way, and he didn't make any money out of it, but he heard the voice of God. And so God can choose how he wants to speak, but he has given us a son, Jesus Christ, and through his son, he has given us eternal life. There's another story. This one is from the New Testament, and it's the story of a man, Saul, whose name becomes Paul. But this is found in the Acts of the Apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts. And so this is a story where Paul is now converted, because before he was converted, this guy killed Christians. He was Jewish, and he thought that they were, he thought they were evil, and he thought he was doing God's will, killing off Christians. And Jesus himself stops him on the road and asks him a simple question. Why do you kick against the goads, Saul? Saul doesn't even know who he is. He says, Lord, who are you? I don't even know who you are. And he says back to Saul at that time, he says, my name is Jesus of Nazareth. And Saul is blinded. He completely blind. And for days, he is guided around in the dark. This man who was the chief, that would kill. He was the head of those that put Christians to death. Even a story. There's a young man whose name was. Uh, uh, I'm losing his name right here. Stephen. His name was Stephen, and Stephen, in the New Testament time, after Jesus had gone into heaven, Jesus has already ascended into heaven, and this after Jesus is ascended into heaven, he has this meeting with Saul, who becomes Paul. He says, "Why are you killing off? Why are you kicking against the goads? Why are you killing? This is not." He says, "I am Jesus of Nazareth." And the point was, Jesus has authority over all the earth, all of it. That's just how it is. He does. And so Saul says, "Who is this?" He doesn't even know the Son of God. He doesn't even know who he is. And Jesus says, "I am Jesus of Nazareth." And Saul falls on his knees, and in the next little bit of time, Saul's name is changed to Paul, and over the next few years, he becomes the foundation. He writes much of the perspective of the leadership that's in the church, that we still honor his teachings today. And along the way, Paul is trying to go to Jerusalem. In his heart, over and over, he gets this message from God that it's time for him to go to Jerusalem. There's a special message there for his brothers, the people that he loves. And he's preached to the Gentiles. People have been converted from every walk of life, and Paul now has been the one. Paul's eyes are opened again after so many days, and his heart is warmed and changed, and now he is hearing the voice of God in Jesus and follows his voice. And the voice has now said, it's time to go to Jerusalem. So he's on his way, and God talks to each one of us. If we open our hearts to him, he speaks to us. He will speak to us about our life and our future. And we long for a voice. We long for a sound from heaven. Each of us do. We long to hear God speak. And it's in our hearts. Sometimes it's not a literal voice. Sometimes it just is our hearts that want to love and care and help people. And that's part of the next part of this story, because Paul is trying to go to Jerusalem, and some of his friends are saying to him, you don't need to go, because those people that are there are just like you, and they're going to kill you. You'll be the next one to die, because they don't put up with Christians, and the Jewish people don't see it. They don't all get it very much, and especially those that lead, the leadership, the religious leaders of the Jews are going to put you to death. And so they warn him, and they tell him, you need to be careful. All they're trying to do is say, we love you, and we don't want your life to suffer. We want you to have a full life. You've given now for years to all of us, and we want you to live on. And Paul says, I've got to go to Jerusalem, because there's a message in me that has to come out. And so he goes, and there's nothing anybody can do. They can't stop him. He finds his way that way. And that the rest that happens in Jerusalem, that's for another time to talk about. The idea here is, though, that in different ways, God speaks into the earth. Sometimes you're sort of a bystander. Sometimes you're a donkey. Sometimes you're someone who's thinking you're doing what's right, and he speaks to you, and you find out that there's a totally different way that is actually the right way. And Each of us has a divine destiny. And it's our work that once we hear this, that we just say yes to God. Have a wonderful night.